It's the moment you've all been waiting for. The fight of the century. The ultimate clash of systems. Capitalism versus socialism! One must win and the other must fall, because this town ain't big enough for the two of them. At least that's the idea that you might get if you listen to a lot of people on the internet. But in reality, this is kind of an oversimplification of the communism-socialism issue. Today, I want to dive into questions about what capitalism and socialism are, and how we should look at the theory and application of each vis-a-vis the other. Once this is understood from the perspective of economics, you might find that they aren't as diametrically opposed as you thought. As a quick side note, I'm not going to be talking about communism specifically here, which is a very particular form of socialism. I'll be focused more on socialism broadly speaking. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, first things first. To understand these concepts, it's going to require a general understanding of what capital is. So let's explore what that means to an economist. Okay, in order to produce, like, a chair, you're going to need the wood that you'll turn into that chair. Fine. But beyond that, you're also going to need some combination of the major factors of production. That's land, labor, and capital. Land and labor are simple enough concepts to understand, and we can pretty much grasp what they are by the names alone. The last one, capital, is a little bit weirder. So capital is basically everything else that you need in order to get the work done. So that includes tools, machines, buildings in which to work, vehicles, organizational structures, infrastructures of all kind, etc., etc., etc. So it's also related to the money that's required to buy those things in order to start a business in the first place, which you can call financial capital. Just like with land and labor and everything else for that matter, there's a limited amount of capital available for use throughout the whole economy. And we as a society have to find some way to make decisions about where, when, and how to use it. Which brings us to the clash of ideas. So what is capitalism? Well, when you work your way through all of the anti-capitalist rhetoric that gets thrown around in some circles, the basic principle is this. The economy will maximize efficiency and productivity when capital is employed in such a way that it is most productive. So say we have just like one extra hammer, right? Should we give it to the guy who makes chairs? Or should we give it to someone who builds houses? Where will the addition of that one hammer provide the most extra benefit to the economy and society? This is pretty basic resource allocation stuff, and generally we all pretty much agree on it. And it's not just for capital, it's the same thing is true for labor and land. On a large economy-wide scale, these are really hard questions to answer. The capitalist says that the best way to get closest to the right answer is to have the chairmaker and the house builder compete for it. Whoever's willing to give the most for the use of the hammer is the one who will benefit the most from its use. Whoever owns the hammer will then make the decision based on which person will make the most use of the hammer according to their own projections and beliefs about the short-term and long-term advantages, as well as their own personal, subjective, moral, and practical judgments. The advantage is that the owner of the hammer is personally invested in making sure that that hammer contributes the most value to the economy, and so they'll try to make sure that that happens. And when all such decisions throughout the entire economy are put together, the hope is that they'll sort of even out to something fairly closely resembling an ideal allocation of resources. The key component is that the person or group of people who make decisions about capital must stand to benefit directly when that capital contributes to productivity. In other words, there has to be owners of that capital who can collect income on its behalf and make decisions about where, when, and how it gets used. Needless to say, capital is not sentient and can't make those decisions on its own. The same is true for land. Labor, on the other hand, can, in theory, make those decisions for itself insofar as it has sufficient bargaining power and mobility. As we all know, there are some issues with that in the modern world, but that's another topic. Socialism as a general concept is actually in full agreement with capitalism on all of this. Allow me to explain. There are many forms of socialism that vary quite dramatically, but they all revolve around the general idea that the means of production, that is, land and capital, should be owned collectively, whether that be by the government, a small community unit, or just the workers who make direct use of it. Why suggest this? Well, the problem to be solved is that individuals are best at understanding how things will affect them, but they're not quite so good at really understanding how things will affect everyone else. and so they may seem poorly equipped to be making the decisions about how to use capital. They're pretty good at figuring out how to earn the most money with their capital, but that's not always the same thing as what's best for the society as a whole. For a discussion of this, check out my video on market failures. The link is in the description. The contention of the socialist is that the best way to approximate the ideal allocation of resources is to have those decisions made in some sort of collective or democratic way. If the means of production, capital, are owned collectively, then we're more likely to make decisions about how to employ them in the interest of benefiting society as a whole, as opposed to one person or a small group of people. Ultimately, socialism agrees that capital should be employed where it is most productive, and that this is best accomplished by having the owners of capital make those decisions. But it's generally concerned with questions of who exactly should be the owners of that capital. So you see, capitalism at its core is an idea about the best strategy for efficiently allocating limited resources. Socialism, on the other hand, is an idea about the best structural organization to facilitate that very strategy. When you really get down to it, the two ideologies aren't even about the same thing. It's important to note that the idea of capitalism came out of liberal philosophical thought about personal and individual rights and freedoms. It stands in contrast to previous systems where a leader or superior could tell you what you could and could not do with your own resources, that is, land, labor, and capital, even though they had no direct personal stake in the income generated by those resources. As a result, the concept of capitalism is not inherently opposed to collective ownership, just so long as that ownership is true ownership, and everyone who has a stake in that ownership has decision-making authority and collects direct benefits commensurate with that ownership. Since nothing in this world will ever be perfect, both ideas, of course, run into problems. The problems of capitalism are mostly pretty well known. It is indeed very difficult to fully internalize the effects of your decisions on the economy as a whole. And since the economy as a whole affects you, it's also actually difficult to fully internalize the effects of your decisions on yourself. We humans, especially with the help of computers, have amazing analytical and decision-making abilities, but we're still not gods. Even professional chess players have to make decisions and moves based on rules of thumb, which can sometimes have results that are less than ideal. And the economy is far more complicated than a game of chess. What's more, the institutions that set the rules of that game can be skewed in terms of whose interests are favored over others and who has more influence in rule setting. Thus, many of the problems that we see in modern systems come from the manipulation of those institutions by self-interested people. This can lead to so many problems that it's not even worth starting to list them here, but on a basic level, it can cause the rules to be set in such a way that individuals are insulated from internalizing the full effects of their decisions. And it can even incentivize people to focus on short-term gains at the expense of even their own long-term benefit, let alone the long-term benefit of society as a whole. While capitalism's problems come from people's inability to fully understand the effects of their decisions, socialism's problems come from their inability to comprehend the complex system as a whole. And nobody fully, truly understands the mechanisms through which the economy functions. I mean, they can guess, but they can't do much more than that. Even economists really just do triage, like, we probably need a little bit more of this thing and a little bit less of that thing. And so, any attempt to centrally organize and plan an entire economy is pretty much doomed to failure. This is precisely why there's so much emphasis placed on market systems and incentives. They're a sort of cheat sheet that feeds information back into the market about what is needed and what's worth the time and resources. Not only is it incredibly unlikely that a central planning authority could come across the best allocation of resources without signaling from the market, but there's also a serious problem with flexibility and responsiveness. If you make your best educated guess about a certain economic issue, but your solution turns out to be a bad one, this happens all the time, you have to be able to change course quickly based on the new evidence. Failure to do so can have dramatic economic consequences. If the new course of action has to be chosen collectively, you won't be able to make swift decisions. Not only will you have to get people to agree on what to do, but you'd first have to get them to understand and agree on what the problem even is, which is a major challenge when most of the people may not be involved enough in the relevant systems and activities to actually have a good understanding of them. The only way around this is to cede decision-making authority to some centralized, smaller governing body. However, aside from the possibility of creating a sort of economic totalitarianism, this at least partly nullifies the major benefits of the socialist idea, that decisions can be more representative of the interests of society as a whole when they're made collectively. It also can harm responsiveness by linking decision-making to political considerations rather than purely economic ones. So you have proponents of capitalism saying that socialism can't produce efficient results, and proponents of socialism saying that capitalism only extracts wealth and destroys the environment. Both of these views, however, are cases of characterizing a broad idea by attaching it to a very particular application of it. While we know that attempts to centrally plan an entire economic system have tended to fail in the past, think China in the 1950s and 60s, we also know that there are industries where a private market is even more heavily impaired than a centrally planned one. Again, see my video on market failures. And attempts to either plan or partially control specific parts of an economy have actually been incredibly successful in the past, like in South Korea. And on the other hand, while we know that capitalist impulses to maximize profits have resulted in a fair amount of economic exploitation and environmental degradation, we also know that there are things that we can do to prevent this in terms of laws and rules and regulations, and that we often fail to make these changes, and sometimes even allow more negative changes to occur through things like reckless deregulation and tax cuts. Economists don't normally talk about these things in such an explicit way, what with capitalism this and socialism that. There's really no need since they all pretty much agree on it. But if you go around and read economic research, the general idea that you'll get is this. The incentives that come along with capitalism, and even the flexibility and responsiveness of individual ownership of capital, are in most cases the best system that we have for efficiently allocating resources. But there are a significant number of cases where socialization of or heavy intervention in an industry is necessary for efficiency and progress. And even when that's not the case, the system still requires well-designed rules and institutions to maintain properly functioning incentives. In the end, it's all about the rules of the game. That means taxes, regulations, criminal law, whatever money and services the government offers to its citizens, and so on. Setting up the system in the right way can help to motivate the right decisions, penalize the bad ones, redistribute some of the earnings of capital through taxation, and prevent excessive wealth accumulation. Our job as citizens is to make sure that those rules are shaped in such a way that there is a harmony between the best interest of the individual and the best interest of society at large. So as usual, thanks for listening, and I really hope I've given you something interesting to think about. If you have any questions or suggestions of topics that you'd like me to talk about in the future, go ahead and drop them in the comments. And if you like what you're seeing, feel free to subscribe. You won't see me stopping you. So yeah, thanks again, and I'll see you next time.